There's a photograph that survived the war, buried in a Soviet archive for 70 years, showing a German Panzer IV tank tilted at a 45-degree angle, its front half swallowed by thick black mud. The crew is nowhere to be seen. What makes this image extraordinary isn't the tank itself, but the wooden sign visible in the foreground, painted in fresh white letters, Achtung Minen, danger, mines ahead. Except there were no mines. The sign was a lie, carefully planted by a man who understood something the Nazi war machine never anticipated, that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't steel or explosives, but simple human psychology and the weight of a tank against the unforgiving earth. This is the story of how a single farmer, armed with nothing but paint, wood, and an intimate knowledge of his own land, turned the invaders' caution into their doom. By the time you reach the end of this video, you'll understand why this act of brilliant sabotage was erased from history, and why the name of the man who did it was deliberately forgotten by both sides. The year was 1941, and the German Wehrmacht was carving through Eastern Europe like a knife through butter. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had proven unstoppable. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in months. Now Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was underway, and 3 million German soldiers were pushing east with a momentum that seemed irreversible. In the flat, endless landscapes of Belarus and Western Russia, the terrain itself became a character in this war. These were lands of vast fields, dense forests and soil that transformed with the seasons. During summer, the earth was firm enough to support the weight of civilization. But when the rains came, this same earth became Rasputitsa, the season of mud, a phenomenon that could swallow horses, trucks, and even the most advanced tanks the Third Reich could produce. The local farmers knew this land like they knew their own children. They understood that beneath the surface of every field lay clay-rich soil that, when saturated, became something closer to quicksand than mud. In a small farming village 30 kilometers southwest of Minsk, a man named Dmitry Volkov watched the German advance with the quiet calculation of someone who had spent 53 years reading the language of the earth. Volkov wasn't a soldier. He had never fired a rifle in anger, had never thrown a grenade, had never even raised his voice in confrontation. He was a farmer, pure and simple, a man whose hands were more familiar with plow handles than weapons. His farm sat on 200 hectares of land that his grandfather had worked, that his father had worked, and that he had intended to pass to his own sons. But his 2 sons were already gone, conscripted into the Red Army and sent to the front, their fates unknown. His wife had died 3 years earlier from pneumonia. The farm, the land, the memory of his family, this was all Dmitry had left. And now, columns of German tanks were rolling down the main road that cut through his property, their treads tearing up the path his family had used for 3 generations. The Germans had established a supply route that ran directly through the region, a vital artery connecting their forward positions to the rear echelon. Every day, convoys of trucks, half-tracks and panzer tanks rumbled past Volkov's farmhouse, their engines roaring, their commanders standing in open hatches surveying the conquered territory with the confidence of men who believed they were building an empire that would last 1,000 years. The Wehrmacht had scattered warning signs throughout the occupied territories, marking genuine minefields that Soviet forces had laid during their retreat. These signs, painted in stark black and white with the skull and crossbones, had become a familiar sight. The German soldiers had learned to respect them absolutely because the Soviet mines were real and they were devastating. A single TM-35 anti-tank mine could blow the tread off a panzer or flip a truck into the air. The signs had saved countless German lives, and the invaders had come to trust them implicitly. Volkov noticed something during those first weeks of occupation that most people would have overlooked. He watched how the tank commanders reacted when they approached areas marked with mine warnings. They would slow down, halt their columns, send scouts forward on foot, and then carefully navigate around the marked zones, even if it meant taking their heavy vehicles off the road and onto harder ground. The Germans feared mines more than they feared bullets because mines were patient, invisible, and absolutely indiscriminate. A mine didn't care if you were a private or a colonel, didn't care if your tank was worth 50,000 Reichsmarks, or if you had a family waiting in Bavaria. Volkov realized that this fear was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht. And he realized something else, something that would change everything. The Germans couldn't tell a real minefield from a fake one just by looking at a sign. They had to trust the markers, because the alternative was to send men to their deaths checking every meter of suspicious ground. On a cool morning in late September, as the first autumn rains began to soften the earth, Dmitry Volkov walked into his barn and found 4 wooden planks, left over from a fence repair he'd never completed. He carried them to his workshop, along with a can of white paint that he'd been saving to repaint his kitchen shutters. He spent 3 hours carefully recreating the mine warning signs he'd seen the Germans use, matching the lettering style, getting the skull and crossbones symbol exactly right, making sure the paint was thick enough to look official and weathered enough to look like it had been there for weeks. When he was finished, he had 4 perfect replicas of German mine warning signs, indistinguishable from the real thing. Then, in the darkness just before dawn, he carried those signs to the wettest, softest, most treacherous section of his land, a low area where spring meltwater always pooled, where the clay content was so high that even his lightest tractor would sink to its axles if he wasn't careful. And there, methodically and deliberately, he planted his false warnings, positioning them to suggest that the hard-packed road was mined, and that the only safe passage was through the innocent-looking field beside it. The field that would become a graveyard of steel. The first convoy arrived 3 days later, just as the morning fog was lifting from the fields. Volkov was in his barn pretending to repair a harness, but his attention was fixed on the road. He heard them before he saw them, the distinctive rumble of diesel engines and the metallic clanking of tank treads against packed earth. 4 Panzer III tanks, followed by 2 supply trucks and a command vehicle, moving at a steady pace toward the front lines. The column was commanded by a young Hauptmann, a captain whose name Volkov would never know, a man who had survived France and Yugoslavia and believed he understood the dangers of occupied territory. As the lead tank approached the section of road where Volkov had planted his signs, the commander spotted the white-painted warnings through his field glasses. The column immediately halted. Volkov watched from the shadows of his barn as German soldiers dismounted, approached the signs on foot and examined them carefully. One of them, an older sergeant, traced his finger over the painted letters, nodded to himself, and returned to report to his commander. The discussion that followed was brief. The Germans faced a simple choice: risk the marked road or take the detour through the adjacent field, which looked firm and safe and completely mine-free. The captain made his decision quickly, the way officers are trained to do. He couldn't risk his tanks on a marked minefield, not for a simple supply run, not when there was an obvious alternative route. He ordered his column to leave the road and traverse the field, spacing the vehicles 30 meters apart as doctrine required, proceeding slowly to test the ground. The first Panzer III rolled off the hardpack and onto Volkov's land, its 30-ton weight supported by relatively narrow treads designed for speed, not soft terrain. For the first 20 meters, everything seemed fine. The ground held. The tank commander, standing in his cupola, probably felt vindicated in his caution. Then the Panzer reached the lowest point of the field, where the clay content was highest, where underground springs kept the soil perpetually saturated even in dry weather. The tank's treads, which had been gripping adequately, suddenly began to slip. The driver gunned the engine, trying to power through, which was exactly the wrong response. The spinning treads dug deeper, the tank's weight pressing down, the suction of the mud pulling it inexorably downward. Within 90 seconds, the Panzer was immobilized, its hull sitting directly on the ground, treads spinning uselessly in thick black muck. The second tank, following 30 meters behind, stopped immediately, but the third commander, unable to see what had happened to the lead vehicle, and assuming this was a mechanical failure rather than a terrain problem, attempted to go around. His Panzer made it 5 meters farther before it too began to sink. The captain, now standing beside his command vehicle, watching 2 of his tanks disappear into what appeared to be solid ground, made a decision that probably saved his remaining vehicles. He ordered a full stop and sent scouts forward on foot to probe the entire field. What they discovered horrified him. The innocent-looking meadow, which showed no standing water, which looked like 1,000 other fields they'd crossed, was actually a carefully disguised bog. The top 6 inches of soil were relatively firm, held together by grass roots and the dry crust of late summer. But beneath that surface lay nearly a meter of saturated clay that had the consistency of cold syrup. A man on foot could cross it safely, his weight distributed over his boots. But a 30-ton tank concentrated all its mass onto narrow steel treads, breaking through the crust immediately and sinking into the mire beneath. The captain understood immediately that he'd been deceived, but he couldn't understand how or by whom. What the German officer didn't know, and what Volkov understood with perfect clarity, was that he'd just activated a trap that required no explosives, no wires, no triggers. The trap was the land itself, the patient, heavy, inexorable physics of saturated clay. The Germans spent 6 hours trying to extract their trapped panzers, using chains, using the other tanks as anchors, bringing up engineering equipment from the rear. They managed to free the second tank, though its transmission was destroyed in the process. But the lead panzer was truly stuck, settled so deeply that recovery would require specialized equipment and a full engineering company. As tactical protocol required, the crew removed all sensitive materials, disabled the tank's radio and gun systems, and reluctantly abandoned it. That night, Volkov watched from his window as German engineers placed demolition charges on the immobilized panzer to prevent it from being recovered and used by Soviet forces. The explosion lit up the darkness, and the shock wave rattled his windows, but Volkov didn't flinch. He'd just destroyed a German tank without firing a shot, without planting a single mine, using nothing but paint and an understanding of his own land. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more German vehicles fell victim to Volkov's trap. The signs remained in place because the Germans, having found no actual mines, assumed they'd been part of Soviet psychological warfare, designed to slow advances, but not actually dangerous. This made them even more effective because tank commanders, believing the signs were false warnings, would deliberately choose what appeared to be the safer alternative route through the field. Each time, the result was the same. Vehicles immobilized, time wasted, resources diverted to recovery efforts, and the intangible but real damage to German morale. Soldiers began to whisper that this section of road was cursed, that the land itself was fighting against them. Volkov never took credit, never boasted, never even told his neighbors what he'd done. He simply went about his daily farm work, watching the Germans struggle against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't shoot and couldn't defeat, an enemy that was literally beneath their feet. The German command structure, efficient and methodical as it was, began to notice the pattern by mid-October. A staff officer in Minsk, reviewing logistics reports, observed that the same 10-kilometer section of supply route was causing disproportionate delays and equipment losses. 7 vehicles immobilized in 3 weeks, all in the same general area, all attributed to terrain difficulties rather than enemy action. This was unacceptable. The officer drafted a report and sent it up the chain of command recommending an investigation. Within 48 hours, a Feldgendarmerie unit, the German military police, arrived in the region with orders to determine whether the vehicle losses were due to natural conditions, Soviet sabotage, or local partisan activity. The investigation was led by a Hauptfeldwebel, a master sergeant named Klaus Richter, who had spent 15 years in the Wehrmacht and had a reputation for thoroughness. Richter understood that in occupied territory, the line between civilian and enemy was often invisible, and that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who appeared harmless. He also understood that someone with detailed knowledge of local terrain could cause enormous damage without ever touching a weapon. Richter began his investigation by interviewing every resident within 5 kilometers of the problem area. He started with the obvious suspects: young men of military age, families with known communist sympathies, anyone who had relatives serving in the Red Army. But most of the young men were already gone, either conscripted or fled into the forests to join partisan groups. The remaining population consisted primarily of women, children, and older men, none of whom seemed capable of or interested in sophisticated sabotage. Volkov was questioned on the 3rd day of the investigation. 2 German soldiers appeared at his farm at dawn, accompanied by a Russian-speaking Ukrainian translator. They found him exactly where he wanted to be found, in his field repairing a section of fence, looking every bit the part of an exhausted, aging farmer trying to survive occupation. The translator asked him about troop movements, about strangers in the area, about anything unusual he might have observed. Volkov answered each question with the careful vagueness of someone who understood that providing too little information looked suspicious, but providing too much looked like collaboration. He mentioned seeing tanks on the road. Yes, everyone had seen them. He'd heard explosions, certainly, who hadn't? But he knew nothing about minefields, nothing about sabotage, nothing about anything beyond the boundaries of his farm. What saved Volkov during that interrogation was something he couldn't have planned: his complete ordinariness. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a weathered farmer with calloused hands and dirt under his fingernails. A man whose entire life could be read in the lines of his face and the stoop of his shoulders. Richter, who had interrogated hundreds of potential saboteurs and partisans, found nothing suspicious in Volkov's demeanor, no telltale signs of deception, no nervous habits that indicated hidden knowledge. The sergeant did walk the perimeter of Volkov's property, did examine the area where the tanks had become stuck, did even look at the warning signs that had caused so much trouble. But those signs appeared to be standard German military markers, weathered and official-looking, exactly the kind of field-expedient warnings that combat engineers scattered throughout occupied territories. Richter had no reason to suspect they were forgeries, and even less reason to suspect they'd been placed by a 53-year-old farmer. The investigation concluded after 8 days, with a final report stating that the vehicle losses were due to unfortunate terrain conditions, compounded by inadequate reconnaissance and the unfamiliarity of German crews with the seasonal mud phenomenon that locals called Rasputitsa. No sabotage was suspected, no arrests were made, but the German command did make one critical decision based on Richter's report. They ordered that the problematic section of road be abandoned as a primary supply route and designated a longer but more reliable alternative path that added 40 minutes to every convoy's journey. This was exactly what Volkov had hoped for, though he'd never dared to imagine it would actually happen. The rerouting meant fewer German vehicles passing his farm, less attention from occupation authorities, and a small but real disruption to the Wehrmacht's logistics network. More importantly, it meant that his deception had worked perfectly. The Germans had looked directly at his trap, investigated it thoroughly, and concluded that it was nothing more than bad luck and worse terrain. Volkov understood that his greatest protection was the Germans' inability to imagine that a mere farmer could outwit their entire command structure. They were looking for partisans with weapons, for trained saboteurs with explosives, for organized resistance cells. They weren't looking for an old man with a paintbrush and an intimate knowledge of how mud behaves in autumn. For the next 3 weeks, Volkov's life returned to something approaching normal, or at least the new normal of occupation. He tended his remaining livestock, harvested what crops he could, and endured the daily indignities of living under German rule. But he also watched, and he also thought. The success of his first operation had taught him something valuable, that the Germans' own systems could be turned against them, that their reliance on signs and markers and official procedures created vulnerabilities that a clever person could exploit. He began to notice other patterns in the occupation, other routines that the Germans followed with mechanical precision, other places where a small deception might cause disproportionate chaos. The warning signs were still in place, now ignored by German convoys that used the alternate route, but serving as a permanent reminder of what he'd accomplished. And in the dark privacy of his thoughts, Dmitry Volkov began planning his next operation, something even more audacious than the first. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the brutal reality that would define the German experience on the Eastern Front. By November, temperatures had dropped below freezing, and the mud that had plagued the Wehrmacht transformed into something equally treacherous, iron-hard frozen ground covered by increasingly deep snow. The German supply lines, already stretched thin by the vast distances of Russia, began to crack under the strain of winter warfare. Volkov watched as the convoys on the alternate route became less frequent, their vehicles moving slower, their crews bundled in inadequate winter gear that had been designed for a war the German High Command had promised would end before the first snowfall. The occupation itself became harsher as German frustration grew. Villages were requisitioned for food with increasing aggression, livestock was confiscated, and any hint of resistance was met with collective punishment. 3 men from a neighboring village were hanged in the town square for the suspected murder of a German motorcycle courier, their bodies left on display for a week as a warning. Volkov understood that the window for resistance was narrowing, that winter would soon make any outdoor activity suspicious, and that he needed to act again before the deep snows made movement impossible. His second operation was born from observation and opportunity. The Germans had established a forward logistics depot about 8 kilometers from his farm, a collection of warehouses and supply dumps guarded by a reinforced infantry platoon. Every morning at 0600 hours, a supply convoy would depart from this depot, traveling east toward the front lines with ammunition, fuel, food, and winter equipment. The convoys followed the same route every single day, the kind of predictable pattern that would have horrified any competent security officer, but which had become inevitable given the limited road network and the desperate need to maintain regular deliveries. Volkov had scouted this route carefully, always with a legitimate reason for being in the area, always moving like a man checking trap lines or searching for lost livestock. He identified a section where the road ran through dense forest, where the trees grew close enough to the roadside that their branches created a natural canopy, where visibility was limited and a man could work unobserved if he chose his timing carefully. More importantly, he noticed that the Germans had placed directional signs at every major intersection along this route, wooden markers painted in military green with white arrows indicating Richtung Osten, direction east, to guide drivers who were unfamiliar with the area. The beauty of Volkov's plan was its simplicity and its complete deniability. He didn't need to sabotage vehicles or cut communication lines or engage in any action that would obviously be recognized as hostile. He needed only to create confusion at exactly the right moment and let the Germans' own procedures do the rest. On a moonless night in late November, Volkov made his way to the forested section of the supply route, carrying tools he'd carefully selected: a shovel, a hammer, wooden stakes, and most importantly, 2 signs he'd painted in his barn. These signs were perfect reproductions of the German directional markers, down to the font style and the weathering of the paint. The only difference was the direction of the arrows. Where the original signs pointed east toward the front, Volkov's forgeries pointed north, toward a secondary road that led deep into the forest and eventually dead-ended at an abandoned Soviet collective farm that had been burned during the initial invasion. He worked quickly in the darkness, his hands numb from cold, removing the original signs and replacing them with his counterfeits. The swap took less than 20 minutes. The removed signs he buried in the snow 100 meters into the forest, where they wouldn't be found until spring thaw. The next morning, the supply convoy departed on schedule, 4 trucks loaded with winter uniforms and rations, escorted by an armored car and a squad of infantry riding in a half-track. The lead driver, a corporal from Bavaria who'd been driving supply runs for 6 weeks and knew the route by memory, wasn't paying close attention as he approached the forested intersection. The early morning light was weak. He was tired from another sleepless night in an unheated barracks, and he trusted the signs because the signs had never been wrong before. When he saw the directional marker pointing north, his mind supplied the assumption that this must be a new route, perhaps changed due to partisan activity or road conditions on the usual path. He turned north. The 3 trucks behind him, following at standard intervals, turned north as well. The escort vehicles, trusting the judgment of the lead driver, followed the convoy. Within 10 minutes, the entire supply column was traveling in completely the wrong direction, moving deeper into the forest on a road that was becoming narrower and less maintained with every kilometer. It took 40 minutes before the lead driver realized something was wrong, another 20 minutes to find a place wide enough to turn the convoy around, and by the time they retraced their route and found the correct road, they were nearly 3 hours behind schedule. 3 hours might not sound catastrophic, but in the context of military logistics during winter warfare, it was a disaster. The supplies these trucks carried were expected at forward positions at a specific time, calculated to arrive before the next scheduled bombardment, timed to coordinate with troop rotations and ammunition requirements. The delay cascaded through the entire supply network, causing units at the front to postpone operations, forcing soldiers to ration food for an extra day, leaving men in exposed positions without the winter gear they desperately needed. The German command investigated the incident immediately, sending officers to examine the route and determine how an entire convoy had become lost on what should have been a routine run. They found the signs pointing north, assumed they'd been vandalized by partisans or had been damaged by weather, and replaced them with new markers. They disciplined the convoy commander for failing to use his map and compass to verify his route. They tightened security procedures and ordered all drivers to double-check directional signs against written orders. But they never suspected that the signs had been deliberately forged and placed by someone who understood their system well enough to exploit it, never imagined that a local farmer had just cost them 3 hours of operational time and created doubt in a logistics network that depended on absolute reliability. Volkov's success with the directional signs taught him something profound about the nature of modern warfare. The German military machine, for all its technological superiority and tactical brilliance, was fundamentally dependent on trust in its own systems. Every sign, every marker, every piece of military infrastructure carried an implicit assumption of authenticity. The Germans had created a web of procedures and protocols designed to move men and material across a continent, and this web was only as strong as the reliability of its smallest components. A forged sign, a misplaced marker, a subtle alteration to the landscape of information that soldiers relied upon, these could cause disruptions far beyond their physical scale. Volkov began to see the occupation not as an impenetrable wall of force, but as a complex system full of potential failure points, each one waiting for someone clever enough to exploit it. He also understood, with the grim clarity of a man who'd already risked his life twice, that his luck wouldn't hold forever. Every operation increased the likelihood of discovery. Every success made the Germans more vigilant, and winter was making it harder to move unobserved. If he was going to strike again, it needed to be soon, and it needed to be his most devastating action yet. The opportunity came from an unexpected source, a drunken conversation he overheard in early December while hiding in the loft of his barn. A German supply truck had broken down near his property, and while the crew waited for a recovery vehicle, 2 of the soldiers had wandered into his barn seeking shelter from the wind. They didn't know Volkov was above them, lying perfectly still in the hay, and they spoke freely in German, a language Volkov had learned adequately during the First World War when he'd been a prisoner for 8 months in a camp near Dresden. The soldiers were complaining about a new security measure that had been implemented along the main supply routes. The Wehrmacht, increasingly paranoid about partisan activity, had begun placing anti-tank obstacles at strategic points along roads, concrete dragon's teeth and steel hedgehogs that could be quickly deployed to block access in case of attack. But these obstacles were also movable, designed to be shifted aside when friendly convoys needed to pass. The key detail that made Volkov's heart race was this: the obstacles were marked with reflective paint and positioned according to a simple system. Red markers indicated obstacles that were permanently in place, blocking secondary roads that led to known partisan areas. Yellow markers indicated temporary obstacles that would be moved aside during scheduled convoy times. The soldiers grumbled about the tedious work of moving these obstacles 3 times per day, complained about the precise schedule they had to maintain, and cursed the officers who designed such a cumbersome system. Volkov remained motionless in the hay until long after the soldiers had left, his mind working through the implications of what he'd heard. The Germans had created a system where obstacles could be identified and understood from a distance, where the color of a marker told you whether a barrier was permanent or temporary, where the schedule of convoy movements was predictable enough that guards could be assigned to move obstacles at specific times. This was operational security at its worst, convenience prioritized over caution, and it represented an opportunity that Volkov knew he couldn't ignore. The plan that formed in his mind was more complex than anything he'd attempted before, requiring materials he didn't have, precise timing, and a willingness to venture much farther from his farm than he'd previously risked. It would also require him to act during daylight hours, during a period when German patrols were active, which meant the chances of getting caught had increased exponentially. But the potential impact was enormous. If he could manipulate the obstacle system, he could cause a convoy to crash directly into barriers they believed had been moved aside, creating not just delays, but actual casualties, not just inconvenience, but measurable damage to German combat effectiveness. Over the next week, Volkov prepared with the meticulous care of a man who understood that a single mistake would cost him his life. He needed yellow paint, the specific shade the Germans used for their temporary obstacle markers, and he found it in the most unlikely place, abandoned in a bombed-out schoolhouse where Soviet authorities had stored maintenance supplies before the invasion. He needed detailed knowledge of the obstacle locations and convoy schedules, which he gathered through careful observation, spending frigid hours hidden in the forest, watching German movements and noting the precise times when barriers were moved. He needed to identify the perfect target, a location where a convoy moving at speed would have minimal time to react, where the consequences of hitting an immobilized obstacle would be severe. He found that location on a downhill section of road that curved sharply to the left, where a line of dragon's teeth blocked a side path, where the temporary yellow markers indicated the obstacles were moved aside 3 times daily to allow supply convoys to use a bypass route that avoided a damaged bridge on the main road. The geometry was perfect. A truck moving at 40 kilometers per hour down that hill, expecting the obstacles to be cleared, would have perhaps 3 seconds to react when the driver realized the barriers were still in place. The night before his operation, Volkov sat in his kitchen and wrote a letter he had no intention of sending, addressed to his sons whose fates he still didn't know. He wrote about the farm, about the land their grandfather had cleared, about the responsibility he felt to fight in the only way available to him. He wrote that he wasn't a hero, wasn't brave, wasn't anything special, just a man who refused to let invaders destroy everything his family had built, without offering some resistance, however small. He sealed the letter, placed it in a tin box under his floorboards, and went to bed fully clothed. At 4 in the morning, 3 hours before dawn, he rose and began the longest walk of his life, carrying a small can of paint and a brush, heading toward a checkpoint he'd scouted a dozen times, preparing to commit an act that would either go completely unnoticed or would get him killed before sunset. Either way, Dmitry Volkov had made his peace with the outcome. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, the kind of blackness that comes only in deep winter, when cloud cover blocks even starlight and the world reduces to shapes and sounds rather than visible forms. Volkov moved through the forest parallel to the road, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping branches buried under snow, controlling his breathing to minimize the vapor clouds that would be visible in the cold air. He'd left his farm at 4:15, giving himself 2 hours to cover the 3 kilometers to his target location and complete his work before the first German patrol began its morning rounds at 6:30. The temperature had dropped to nearly 20 degrees below 0 Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, cold enough that the paint he carried might become too thick to apply properly. He'd wrapped the paint can inside his coat to keep it from freezing solid, and the brush was tucked into his belt, the bristles protected by a cloth sleeve. Every few hundred meters he would stop, listen for engines or voices, scan the darkness for the telltale glow of cigarettes or lanterns, and only then continue forward. The forest was silent, except for the occasional crack of a tree branch contracting in the cold, sounds that made his heart race until he identified their source. He reached the target location at 5:40, later than he'd hoped, but still with enough time if he worked quickly. The obstacle position was exactly as he'd observed during his reconnaissance, a row of concrete dragon's teeth, each one a meter tall and shaped like a pyramid, painted with yellow reflective bands that caught the faint light from the overcast sky. These particular obstacles were positioned to block a bypass road that curved away from the main route, and they were moved aside every morning at 6:45, 15 minutes before the first scheduled convoy of the day passed through. The moving was done by a 2-man team that arrived in a motorcycle with a sidecar, positioned themselves at either end of the obstacle line, and used steel hooks to drag each dragon's tooth to the side of the road, clearing a path wide enough for trucks. The entire process took about 8 minutes, and the obstacles remained moved until after the evening convoy passed at 1800 hours. Volkov's plan was breathtakingly simple. He would repaint the yellow markers red, transforming temporary obstacles into what appeared to be permanent barriers. The convoy drivers, seeing red markers from a distance, would assume these obstacles were never moved, that the bypass was closed and would remain on the main route. But the obstacle-moving team, who didn't check marker colors but simply followed their schedule, would still move the barriers aside at the appointed time, clearing a path that no one would use. Except Volkov had one additional modification planned, the element that would transform this from a mere prank into actual sabotage. After the morning team moved the obstacles aside, he would return and repaint them yellow again, but he would reposition the markers on obstacles that hadn't been moved, obstacles that were still blocking the road. The result would be a trap of perception. Convoy drivers approaching in the afternoon, seeing yellow markers in the distance, would assume the bypass was clear and would turn onto it at speed, only to discover at the last second that the obstacles were still in place. The afternoon convoy typically moved faster than the morning run, the drivers more confident after completing the route once already, less cautious about the road conditions. Her truck hitting Dragon's Teeth at 40 or 50 kilometers per hour wouldn't just be damaged, it would likely flip, and in a military convoy where vehicles traveled close together, one crash could cause a chain reaction. Volkov worked with hands that trembled from cold and adrenaline, using a small brush to apply red paint over the yellow reflective bands. The paint, kept warm against his body, flowed adequately despite the temperature, covering the yellow with a layer thick enough to be opaque. He worked on only 4 obstacles, the ones positioned at the entrance to the bypass, the ones that would be most visible to approaching drivers. The entire process took 12 minutes, and with every passing second, he expected to hear the motorcycle engine of the early patrol, expected to feel the sudden pressure of a rifle barrel against his spine, expected his small war to end with a bullet in a frozen ditch. But the forest remained silent, and at 5:54 he finished the last obstacle, stepped back to examine his work in the growing dawn light, and saw with satisfaction that the markers now appeared convincingly red, indicating permanent barriers that wise drivers would avoid. He retreated into the tree line, found a position with clear sight lines to both the obstacles and the approach road, and settled in to wait for the morning crew. The motorcycle arrived at 6:42, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, carrying 2 soldiers who looked miserable and cold and completely uninterested in anything beyond completing their task and returning to a heated guardhouse. They worked mechanically, hooking the obstacles and dragging them aside without even glancing at the color of the markers, following a routine they'd performed dozens of times. Within 7 minutes the bypass was clear, a 30-meter gap in the obstacle line creating an open path from the main road. The soldiers remounted their motorcycle and departed, and Volkov was left alone with the next phase of his plan. He had 8 hours until the afternoon convoy, 8 hours during which he needed to return home, maintain his normal routine to avoid suspicion, and then come back to this location to reposition his painted markers onto obstacles that were still blocking the road. 8 hours during which anything could go wrong, during which German patrols might notice the repainted markers, during which the weather might change or the convoy schedule might be altered, or pure chance might unravel everything he'd planned. But Volkov had committed himself to this path, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited him, because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing in the face of occupation was a surrender he refused to accept. Volkov returned to his farm by 8:30, using a different route through the forest to minimize the chances of creating an identifiable trail pattern. He forced himself to perform his normal morning tasks with the same methodical slowness he always displayed, milking his 2 remaining cows, feeding the chickens that had somehow survived German requisitions, checking the integrity of his barn roof where snow had begun to accumulate dangerously. A German patrol passed by his property at 10:15, 2 soldiers on foot moving along the road, and he waved to them with the careful deference of a man who understood that appearing too friendly was suspicious, but appearing hostile was suicidal. They ignored him completely, which was exactly what he wanted. By noon, he'd eaten a small meal of black bread and dried sausage, forcing the food down despite having no appetite, knowing he needed energy for what was coming. At 1300 hours, he began his return journey to the obstacle site, this time carrying his paint and brush openly in a cloth sack, prepared with a cover story about collecting medicinal bark from specific trees, a story that would explain his presence in the forest if questioned, but which he prayed he'd never have to use. He reached the obstacle position at 1420, and the scene was exactly as he'd left it. The barriers still moved aside, the bypass route clear and inviting, the repainted markers on the displaced obstacles showing red in the afternoon light. The afternoon convoy was scheduled to pass at 1500 hours, which gave him 35 minutes to complete the most dangerous part of his operation. He needed to take markers from the obstacles that had been moved aside and reposition them onto obstacles that were still in place, creating the illusion that the bypass was clear when in fact it remained blocked. The physical work was simple, requiring only that he pry the reflective markers loose and nail them onto different obstacles. But the risk was immense, because he was now working in full daylight, on a road that German vehicles used regularly, in a position where he had limited ability to flee if discovered. He worked faster than he'd ever worked in his life, his hands clumsy in thick gloves but moving with desperate efficiency, transferring 4 yellow markers from cleared obstacles to barriers that still blocked the bypass entrance. The hammering of nails sounded impossibly loud in the quiet forest, each strike a potential signal to any patrol within hearing distance. At 1447, 13 minutes before the convoy was scheduled to arrive, Volkov completed his work and retreated into the forest. From his hidden position, the trap looked perfect. The bypass entrance appeared completely clear from the main road, with inviting yellow markers visible at a distance suggesting that obstacles had been properly moved aside. A driver approaching at speed would see those markers, see what appeared to be an open path, and would commit to the turn before realizing that Dragon's teeth were still positioned across the road, now unmarked and nearly invisible against the snow-covered ground. The physics of the situation were unavoidable. A loaded supply truck weighing 8 tons and traveling at 45 kilometers per hour would require at least 40 meters to stop on winter roads. The distance from the turn to the first obstacle was 32 meters. There would be no time to brake, no room to maneuver, no possibility of avoiding impact. Volkov felt no satisfaction in this knowledge, no excitement about the destruction he was about to cause. Instead, he felt a cold certainty that he'd crossed a line from passive resistance into active warfare, that men might die in the next few minutes because of decisions he'd made, and that he would have to live with those deaths for whatever remained of his life. The convoy appeared at 1458, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, a line of 5 trucks moving at good speed down the main road. Volkov could see the lead vehicle clearly from his position, could see the driver's silhouette through the windscreen, could see the canvas cover over the cargo bed, flapping in the wind of passage. The convoy approached the junction where the bypass branched from the main route, and Volkov watched as the lead driver, seeing the yellow markers in the distance, began to slow and prepared to make the turn. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds long, when the entire outcome hung in perfect balance, when the driver might have noticed something wrong, might have seen the obstacles that were supposed to be moved but weren't, might have reacted in time to avoid disaster. But those 3 seconds passed, the decision was made, and the lead truck committed to the turn onto the bypass road, its momentum carrying it forward at 35 kilometers per hour directly toward concrete barriers that wouldn't move and wouldn't break, and wouldn't care about the lives of the men inside the vehicle that was about to strike them. The impact, when it came, was louder than Volkov had imagined. A tremendous crash of metal against concrete, followed immediately by the secondary sounds of destruction, shattering glass, tearing canvas, the mechanical scream of an engine block rupturing. The lead truck hit the first Dragon's Tooth head-on, the obstacle catching the vehicle just below the front axle. The truck's forward momentum lifting its rear wheels off the ground before physics reasserted control and slammed the entire vehicle down onto its side. The second truck, following at a distance of only 20 meters, had no time to stop and struck the overturned lead vehicle at reduced but still significant speed, adding its mass to the wreckage. The remaining 3 trucks managed to halt, their drivers standing on brake pedals, their vehicles sliding on icy pavement before coming to rest just meters from the crash site. Within seconds, German soldiers were shouting, running toward the wreckage, attempting to extract the crews from the first two trucks. Volkov could see blood on the snow, could see men moving with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of serious injury, could hear screaming that carried clearly through the cold air. He remained absolutely still in his hiding place, watching the chaos he'd created, forcing himself to witness the consequences of his actions rather than looking away. This was war, he told himself. This was resistance. This was the price of occupation. But the justifications felt hollow as he watched German soldiers, men who might have families in Bavaria or Prussia, or wherever they came from, being pulled from destroyed vehicles with injuries that would kill some of them before sunset. After 20 minutes, when a recovery convoy arrived from the nearby depot and the focus of German attention was entirely on the crash site, Dmitry Volkov slipped away into the forest, carrying with him the knowledge that he was no longer just a farmer resisting occupation, but a man who had killed, who would kill again if the opportunity arose, and who had fundamentally changed into something he didn't entirely recognize. The German response to the convoy crash was swift, thorough, and terrifying in its methodical efficiency. Within hours, a full investigative team arrived from the regional command, led by the same Hauptfeldwebel Richter who had investigated the earlier tank incidents. This time, however, Richter approached the scene with a fundamentally different assumption. 3 isolated incidents could be attributed to terrain and poor reconnaissance. 7 vehicle losses could be explained by the challenges of Rasputitsa and unfamiliar ground, but a convoy crash caused by obstacles that should have been moved according to established procedure on a route that had been used successfully for weeks, this could not be coincidence. Richter spent 4 hours at the crash site examining every detail with the patience of a man who understood that small inconsistencies revealed larger truths. He measured distances, photographed the obstacle positions, interviewed the surviving drivers and the soldiers who'd been responsible for moving the barriers that morning. And he found the proof he'd been searching for. Paint residue on concrete, places where yellow markers had been recently nailed over older attachment points, and most damningly, obstacles bearing red paint underneath the yellow, revealing that someone had deliberately repainted the markers to create false signals. This was not accident or negligence. This was sabotage, sophisticated and calculated, executed by someone who understood German procedures well enough to exploit them. Richter's report triggered a security crackdown that affected every civilian within 10 kilometers of the crash site. German troops began systematic house-to-house searches, interrogating residents, examining workshops and barns for evidence of paint, tools, or materials that could be used for sabotage. They established checkpoints on every road, requiring travel permits for any movement between villages. They announced collective punishment protocols. For every German soldier killed by sabotage, 10 local men would be executed, selected by lottery if specific perpetrators couldn't be identified. The occupation, which had been harsh but relatively predictable, became an atmosphere of constant terror, where any action could be interpreted as suspicious, where helping your neighbor could be construed as partisan collaboration, where simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in immediate execution. Volkov watched this transformation with growing horror, understanding that his actions had brought catastrophe not just to the Germans, but to his entire community. 3 men from the neighboring village were arrested on the second day of the crackdown, accused of possessing suspicious quantities of paint. They were executed by firing squad the following morning in the village square, their bodies displayed as a warning. Volkov knew these men, knew they were innocent, knew they'd died because of what he had done. The moral weight of unintended consequences pressed down on Volkov with suffocating force. He'd imagined himself as a resistance fighter, striking blows against an occupying army, disrupting their operations and defending his homeland. But the reality was far more complex and far more terrible. His sabotage had killed German soldiers, yes, but it had also triggered reprisals that killed innocent civilians. Every action produced reactions. Every success generated escalating German countermeasures, and the civilian population was caught between resistance and occupation, suffering from both. Volkov found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of the men who'd been executed, questioning whether his actions had made anything better or had simply added more death to a world already drowning in it. He considered turning himself in, offering his life in exchange for ending the reprisals, but he knew the Germans wouldn't stop with just him. They would interrogate him, torture him for information about partisan networks that didn't exist, and when he couldn't provide what they wanted, they would execute him anyway and continue their reprisals to deter others. His surrender would accomplish nothing except his own death. For 2 weeks, Volkov maintained the appearance of normalcy while German investigators systematically worked through their suspect list. Richter himself visited the farm again, this time with a full security detail and a translator who spoke better Russian. The interrogation lasted 3 hours and was far more intense than the first. Richter had clearly developed a profile of the saboteur he was hunting, someone with military experience, someone with detailed knowledge of German procedures, someone with access to materials and tools, someone physically capable of operating in winter conditions. The questions probed at every aspect of Volkov's background: his service in the First World War, his knowledge of German language and customs, his movements during specific dates and times. Volkov answered with the same patient vagueness he'd used before, but this time he could see doubt in Richter's eyes, a calculation being performed, a judgment being formed. The German sergeant walked through Volkov's barn, examining his workshop with particular attention, looking at his tools, his paint supplies, his collection of wood and metal scraps. He found nothing incriminating because Volkov had buried all evidence weeks earlier, had cleaned his brushes and disposed of empty paint cans in locations miles from his property, had been meticulous about leaving no trail that could connect him to his operations. Richter left without making an arrest, but Volkov knew the investigation wasn't over. The Germans had narrowed their list of suspects and he was certainly on it, watched and waiting for him to make a mistake. The sergeant's parting words, delivered through the translator, carried an unmistakable message. They were patient, they were thorough, and they would eventually find the saboteur who'd caused the convoy crash. It was only a matter of time. That night, Volkov sat in his kitchen with the lights off, staring at the darkness outside his window, understanding that his war was effectively over. He couldn't risk another operation with German attention so focused on his area. He couldn't flee because travel required permits he didn't have, and because abandoning his farm would be an admission of guilt. He couldn't continue because the cost of success had become unacceptable, measured in innocent lives rather than destroyed vehicles. He had become a prisoner not of German occupation, but of his own actions and their consequences, waiting in the cold darkness of winter for a resolution that could only end one way. The farmer who had outwitted the Wehrmacht now faced the possibility that his cleverness had bought him nothing except a different kind of defeat, slower but just as certain as a bullet. The resolution, when it came, arrived from a direction Volkov had never anticipated. In late December, as winter deepened and the Eastern Front began to stabilize into static warfare, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. The Wehrmacht's advance had stalled outside Moscow, halted by Soviet resistance, brutal cold, and supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Red Army, reinforced with Siberian divisions equipped and trained for winter warfare, launched a massive counteroffensive that pushed German forces back across hundreds of kilometers. The front line, which had been steadily moving east for months, suddenly reversed direction, and the occupied territories began to shrink as German units retreated to consolidate defensive positions. Volkov learned of this reversal not from official announcements, but from the evidence he could observe directly. Convoys that had been heading east now traveled west, loaded not with supplies, but with wounded soldiers and salvaged equipment. German units that had been stationed in his region for months suddenly disappeared overnight, redeployed to stop Soviet breakthroughs elsewhere. The occupation infrastructure that had seemed permanent and unshakable began to crumble as the Wehrmacht prioritized survival over control. The German depot near his farm was evacuated in a single chaotic day, vehicles loaded hastily and driven away, warehouses set ablaze to prevent their contents from falling into Soviet hands. By early January, the German presence in Volkov's immediate area had been reduced to occasional patrols and a skeletal garrison holding the regional administrative center. The systematic searches stopped, the checkpoints were abandoned, and the atmosphere of terror lifted slightly as German resources were redirected toward military operations rather than security operations. Richter and his investigative team were reassigned to other duties, their hunt for the saboteur indefinitely postponed by more urgent priorities. Volkov understood that he'd been saved not by his own cunning or by luck, but by the simple fact that the Wehrmacht was losing and no longer had the luxury of dedicating resources to solving past mysteries. His guilt over the executed civilians remained, a weight that he knew would never lift, but his immediate fear of discovery began to fade. He remained on his farm, tending his land, watching the war move away from him like a receding storm. Soviet forces retook his region in mid-February, advancing quickly through areas the Germans had abandoned without a fight. The Red Army soldiers who passed through his village were different from the German occupiers, speaking his language but viewing civilians with similar suspicion, treating liberated territories as potential sources of traitors and collaborators. When Soviet security officers began their own investigations, identifying who had collaborated with Germans and who had resisted, Volkov faced a new and unexpected danger. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, was notoriously paranoid and brutal in its assessments. Civilians who had survived German occupation were automatically suspect, assumed to have collaborated unless they could prove otherwise. Volkov's survival, his intact farm, his lack of visible persecution, all these facts could be interpreted as evidence that he'd cooperated with the occupiers. He needed proof of resistance, needed witnesses who could testify that he'd fought against the Germans, but he deliberately operated in complete secrecy, telling no one about his sabotage activities, leaving no witnesses who could vouch for him. The irony was bitter. He'd successfully hidden his resistance from the Germans, and now that same secrecy threatened to condemn him as a collaborator in Soviet eyes. During his NKVD interrogation, conducted in a requisitioned schoolhouse that still smelled of German cigarettes, Volkov made a calculated decision. He told them everything, described each operation in detail, explained his methods and his targets, provided information that could be verified through German records if anyone cared to check. The NKVD officer listened with an expression of complete skepticism, clearly assuming this was a fabricated story designed to avoid collaboration charges, but verification came from an unexpected source. Among the German documents captured during the Soviet advance were Richter's investigation reports, detailing the sabotage incidents, the vehicle losses, the convoy crash, and the ongoing hunt for the perpetrator. These reports, when translated and reviewed by Soviet intelligence, confirmed every major element of Volkov's account. The NKVD, confronted with documentary evidence from the enemy themselves, had no choice but to accept that this elderly farmer had indeed conducted a sustained sabotage campaign against Wehrmacht logistics. The officer's skepticism transformed into something approaching respect. Though the Soviet system was too cynical to fully embrace individual heroism without suspicion of underlying motives. Volkov was cleared of collaboration charges, but he was also questioned extensively about how he'd learned German procedures, whether he'd received training from anyone, whether he'd been part of a larger network. The truth, that he'd simply observed and adapted, that he'd worked entirely alone out of personal determination, seemed too simple to be believable. Eventually, they let him return to his farm, labeled as a verified partisan resistant, but also marked in their files as someone who bore watching, someone whose cleverness made him potentially dangerous, regardless of which side he was on. The war continued for 3 more years, but for Volkov it had effectively ended. He worked his land, rebuilt what had been destroyed, and lived with memories that grew heavier rather than lighter with time. He never learned the exact casualties his sabotage had caused, never knew the names of the German soldiers who died in the convoy crash or the extent of injuries suffered by others. He never forgot the faces of the 3 innocent men executed in reprisal for his actions, their deaths a permanent stain on his conscience that no justification about resisting occupation could fully absolve. His sons never returned from the war, their fates eventually confirmed through Red Army casualty reports. One killed at Stalingrad, the other dying of typhus in a field hospital in Ukraine. The farm that Volkov had fought to protect, the land that had been his weapon and his motivation, felt empty without the family that should have inherited it. He lived alone, worked alone, and when villagers occasionally asked about his experiences during the occupation, he gave vague answers and changed the subject. The story of the farmer who'd outwitted the Wehrmacht remained untold, locked inside a man who'd learned that victory and defeat were rarely as distinct as people imagined, that resistance came with costs that couldn't be calculated in advance, and that history cared less about individual courage than about the larger movements of armies and nations. Dmitry Volkov died in 1958, 13 years after the war ended, at the age of 70. He collapsed while working in his field, a stroke taking him quickly and without warning, which was perhaps more mercy than a man with his memories deserved. His farm was absorbed into a Soviet collective, his personal effects distributed or discarded, and his story disappeared into the vast silence that the Soviet system imposed on individual narratives that didn't serve official historical purposes. The Communist Party preferred tales of organized partisan units, of coordinated resistance movements led by dedicated party members, not stories of solitary farmers who'd fought their own private wars using nothing but observation and cleverness. Volkov's sabotage operations, though documented in captured German records and confirmed by NKVD investigations, were never publicized, never celebrated, never incorporated into the official narrative of Soviet resistance. The wooden signs he'd forged rotted into the earth. The muddy field that had swallowed German tanks was drained and cultivated. The obstacles he'd repainted were removed during post-war reconstruction. Every physical trace of his actions vanished, leaving only words in classified files that almost no one would ever read. The German side was equally silent about Volkov's exploits, though for different reasons. The Wehrmacht had no interest in preserving stories of how their vaunted military machine had been repeatedly outwitted by an elderly farmer with a paintbrush. Richter's investigation reports were filed away in archives that were captured, scattered, and lost during Germany's collapse. The officers who'd commanded the convoys, the logistics staff who'd designed the obstacle systems, the soldiers who'd survived the crashes, they all had their own reasons for not discussing incidents that highlighted German vulnerability and lack of security awareness. In the post-war years, when former Wehrmacht officers wrote their memoirs and histories, they focused on grand battles and strategic decisions, not on the small embarrassments of supply convoys misled by forged signs or tanks trapped in mud because someone moved a warning marker. The story of Dmitry Volkov existed in the gap between official histories, too minor for one side to celebrate and too embarrassing for the other side to acknowledge, preserved only in fragmentary documents that historians would largely ignore for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and archives began to open, that researchers started piecing together the full scope of civilian resistance during the German occupation. A German graduate student, writing a dissertation on Wehrmacht logistics failures on the Eastern Front, discovered Richter's reports in a military archive in Freiburg. A Russian historian, investigating NKVD files on collaboration accusations, found Volkov's interrogation records and the verification documents that confirmed his sabotage activities. These two researchers, working independently and unaware of each other, reconstructed the same story from opposite perspectives, German frustration and Soviet skepticism both pointing toward the same conclusion, that a farmer named Dmitry Volkov had conducted one of the most creative and effective individual sabotage campaigns of the entire war. Their findings were published in academic journals with limited circulation, presented at conferences attended by specialists, and largely ignored by popular historians who preferred narratives with clearer heroes and more dramatic action. The story remained obscure, known to perhaps a few hundred people worldwide, a footnote in the vast literature of World War II. What makes Volkov's story remarkable isn't just what he accomplished, but what his obscurity reveals about how history is recorded and remembered. We celebrate the pilots who shot down enemy aircraft, the soldiers who captured strategic positions, the spies who stole military secrets. We build monuments to organized resistance movements, to partisan units that ambushed convoys and sabotaged rail lines. But we forget the individual civilians who fought their own private wars, who used whatever tools they had available, who achieved significant results through nothing more than observation, creativity, and courage. Volkov's sabotage operations delayed German convoys, destroyed valuable equipment, tied up security resources during a critical period, and demonstrated that occupation could never be complete as long as the occupied population retained the will to resist. His methods required no weapons, no explosives, no outside support, just an understanding of systems and how to break them. He proved that modern militaries, for all their technological sophistication, were vulnerable to attacks that exploited their dependence on procedures and protocols. These lessons remain relevant today, in an era where warfare increasingly depends on information systems, supply networks, and the assumption that official markers and signals are trustworthy. The greatest irony of Dmitry Volkov's story is that his success depended entirely on being forgotten. His operations worked because he remained invisible, because he told no one what he was doing, because he left no trail that could lead back to him. But that same invisibility ensured that his story would be lost, that his courage would go unrecognized, that his sacrifice would be forgotten by the very people he'd fought to protect. He paid the price of resistance twice, first through the guilt of causing civilian casualties, and second through the erasure of his memory from history. This video exists to restore what was lost, to tell the story of a farmer who understood that war isn't just fought by armies, that resistance doesn't require uniforms or weapons, and that sometimes the most effective sabotage is so subtle that even the victims never fully understand what happened to them. Dmitry Volkov's war was fought in silence and ended in obscurity, but it deserves to be remembered, not because it was glorious or triumphant, but because it was real, human, and true. The next time you see a warning sign or a directional marker, remember that someone, somewhere, might have put it there for reasons you'll never know, and that the invisible hand that shapes the battlefield isn't always the one holding a weapon.